when 17-year-old Abigail Puit's own family threw her into a howling blizzard to die with her unborn twins. They never imagined a scarred mountain man would become her salvation. Cast out by those who should have protected her, bleeding and broken in the snow, Abby's desperate fight for survival would forge an unlikely family in the wilderness and spark a war that would shake the very mountains themselves. This is a story of betrayal, redemption, and the fierce love that can bloom in the darkest of winters. Stay with me until the end to discover how this incredible tale unfolds, and please comment below with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The wind howled like a dying animal across the Colorado Territory, carrying with it the bitter promise of death. Snow fell in thick, merciless sheets, each flake a tiny dagger against exposed skin. In the pale light of a February dawn, 3 figures struggled through the drifts outside the small settlement of Pine Ridge, 2 walking, 1 being dragged. "Please, Papa, I can't." Abigail Puit's voice cracked as another contraction tore through her swollen belly. Her father's grip on her arm tightened, his weathered fingers digging into her flesh through the thin fabric of her worn coat. "You made your choice, girl." Ezra Puit spat, his breath forming angry clouds in the frigid air. "Should have thought about consequences before you spread your legs for that Tate boy." Abigail's mother, Martha, walked several paces behind them, her face a mask of stone. She hadn't spoken a word since they'd roused Abigail from her bed, before Dawn hadn't met her daughter's pleading eyes as they forced her from the only home she'd ever known. "Mama," Abigail gasped, stumbling as her feet caught in a hidden drift. "Please, the babies, they're coming." Martha's step faltered for just a moment, but Ezra's harsh voice cut through any maternal instinct that might have stirred. "She ain't our daughter no more. Dead to us, you hear, dead as she'll be come nightfall." They had reached the edge of the settlement now, where the last ramshackle cabin gave way to endless wilderness. The mountains loomed ahead, their peaks lost in the swirling storm. This was the boundary between civilization and the unknown, between life and death. Ezra released his grip so suddenly that Abigail collapsed into the snow, the impact driving the breath from her lungs. She looked up at her parents, these people who had raised her, fed her, taught her to read and sew and say her prayers, and saw nothing but disgust in their eyes. "Papa, please," she whispered, struggling to push herself up on her elbows. "I'm still your daughter. I'm still—" "You're nothing," he said with finality. "You brought shame on our name, on our family. The preacher says God don't forgive fornication, and neither do we." Martha finally spoke, her voice thin as ice. "Should have listened when we told you to stay away from that Tate boy. Should have known better than to trust a rich man's son with promises." Another contraction seized Abigail, stronger than before, and she doubled over in the snow. When it passed, she looked up to find her parents already walking away, their figures growing smaller and smaller, until the storm swallowed them entirely. She was alone. The reality of it hit her like a physical blow. 17 years old, 8 months pregnant with twins, abandoned in a blizzard with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small bundle containing a few meager possessions. The snow was already soaking through her threadbare coat, and she could feel the cold seeping into her bones. "Help!" she called out, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Someone help me!" But there was no one to hear. Pine Ridge was a small settlement, and everyone would be huddled around their fires, waiting for the storm to pass. No one would venture out in weather like this, not for any reason. Abigail tried to stand, but another contraction drove her back to her knees. The pain was getting stronger, more frequent. She had helped deliver calves on neighboring farms, had assisted the midwife once when Mrs. Henderson's baby came early. She knew the signs. Labor had begun in earnest. "No, no, no," she whispered, pressing her hands against her belly. "Not now, not here, please, not here." But the babies growing inside her had their own schedule, and they weren't waiting for shelter or safety or warmth. They were coming whether she was ready or not. Abigail forced herself to move, crawling through the snow toward a cluster of pine trees that might offer some protection from the wind. Each movement was agony, each breath a struggle against the cold that seemed to be freezing her lungs from the inside out. Her hands were already numb, her feet like blocks of ice in her worn boots. She had made it perhaps 50 yards when the next contraction hit so powerful that she collapsed face first into the snow. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think of anything but the pain that seemed to be tearing her apart from the inside. This was how she was going to die, alone in the snow, giving birth to babies who would freeze before they took their first breath. Her parents would tell the settlement that she had run away in shame, and no one would come looking for her body until spring. By then there would be nothing left but bones scattered by wild animals. The thought of her unborn children dying with her sparked something fierce in Abigail's chest. These babies were innocent. They didn't deserve to pay for her mistakes, for the choices she had made in a moment of weakness and desperation. Caleb Tate. Even thinking his name brought a mixture of love and rage that surprised her with its intensity. The rancher's son, golden-haired and smooth-talking, who had whispered promises of marriage and devotion while his hands roamed her body in the hayloft of her father's barn, who had sworn he loved her, would take care of her, would make her his wife, who had laughed when she told him she was carrying his child. "You think I'd marry a fat farm girl like you?" he had sneered, his beautiful face twisted with cruel amusement. "I was just having some fun. Don't go getting ideas above your station." But the babies weren't Caleb's anymore. They were hers and hers alone. She would protect them, save them, even if it cost her everything. Abigail gritted her teeth and began to crawl again, leaving a trail of blood in the snow behind her. The trees seemed impossibly far away, and with each contraction her strength ebbed a little more. Her vision was starting to blur, whether from pain or cold or exhaustion, she couldn't tell. The wind picked up, driving the snow horizontally across the landscape. In moments like this, Abigail could understand why the old-timers called these storms widowmakers. The cold was a living thing, hungry and patient, waiting for travelers to make one wrong step, one poor decision. Like trusting the wrong man, like believing in pretty words and prettier promises. She had almost reached the trees when she heard the crunch of footsteps in the snow, steady and purposeful. For a moment, hope flared in her chest. Someone was coming. Someone had heard her cries for help. But as the footsteps grew closer, fear replaced hope. What if it wasn't a rescuer? What if it was Caleb, come to finish what her parents had started? What if it was one of his friends, or worse, his father Jeremiah Tate, the most powerful man in 3 counties? Abigail tried to turn to see who was approaching, but another contraction seized her at that moment. She could only lie there in the snow, helpless and exposed as the footsteps drew nearer. "Well, I'll be damned." The voice was deep and rough, with the kind of gravelly quality that came from years of disuse. Definitely not Caleb. This man's voice held none of the smooth charm that had once bewitched her. This was the voice of someone who had seen hard times and harder choices. Abigail managed to lift her head and found herself looking up at a man unlike any she had ever seen. He was tall, taller than her father, taller than any man in Pine Ridge, with shoulders broad enough to block out the storm. His face was weathered and scarred, with deep lines around his eyes and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months. He wore buckskins and furs, a rifle slung across his back, and his dark eyes held a mixture of surprise and something that might have been compassion. "Please," Abigail whispered, her voice barely audible. "Help me." The man, who she would later learn was called Silas Boone, stared down at her for a long moment. She could see him taking in her condition, the blood in the snow, the way her body was racked with contractions. His jaw tightened and something dangerous flickered in his expression. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. My family," she managed. "They left me here, said I was dead to them." Silas's hands clenched into fists. "What kind of people leave a girl in labor out in a blizzard?" "The kind who care more about reputation than family," Abigail said bitterly. Another contraction was building, and she could feel it in the way her belly tightened and hardened. "Please, the babies are coming. I can feel them." Without another word, Silas dropped to his knees beside her. His hands, surprisingly gentle for their size, helped her sit up in the snow. "How many babies?" "Twins," she gasped. "The midwife said twins." Silas muttered something under his breath that sounded like a curse in a language she didn't recognize. Then he was scooping her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing at all, cradling her against his chest. The warmth of his body was like a miracle after the bitter cold of the snow. "Hold on," he said, already moving with long, sure strides through the storm. "My cabin's not far. We'll get you warm, get you safe." Abigail wanted to thank him, wanted to ask his name, wanted to know why a stranger would risk his life for someone like her. But another contraction hit stronger than any before, and all she could do was bury her face against his shoulder and try not to scream. Silas moved through the storm like it was nothing more than a gentle breeze. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, even though the snow was so thick that Abigail couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. His breathing was steady and controlled, as if carrying a woman in the labor through a blizzard was something he did every day. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice rumbling through his chest. "Abigail," she managed. "Abigail Puit. I'm Silas Boone, and I'm going to take care of you, Abigail Puit, you and your babies." The certainty in his voice was like an anchor in the storm. For the first time since her parents had dragged her from her bed, Abigail felt something that might have been hope. They traveled for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes before a structure emerged from the swirling snow. It was a cabin solidly built from thick logs, with smoke rising from a stone chimney. Light glowed warm and golden in the windows, promising heat and safety and shelter from the storm. Silas kicked open the door and carried her inside, the sudden warmth hitting her like a physical force. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from the outside, with a main room dominated by a massive stone fireplace. Furs covered the floor and the walls were lined with shelves, holding supplies, books, and what looked like medical instruments. "You're a doctor?" Abigail asked as Silas lowered her onto a bed near the fire. "Not exactly," he said, already moving around the cabin with practiced efficiency, "but I've delivered my share of babies, human and otherwise." He began gathering supplies, clean cloths, a pot of water, something that looked like it might be medical tools. His movements were quick and sure, with none of the panic that Abigail felt clawing at her chest. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, as another contraction built. "You don't even know me." Silas paused in his preparations, his dark eyes meeting hers. "I know enough. I know you're young and scared and alone. I know someone threw you away like garbage when you needed them most." His voice hardened. "And I know what it's like to lose everything that matters." Before Abigail could ask what he meant, the contraction hit with full force. She gripped the edges of the bed, her back arching, as pain unlike anything she had ever experienced tore through her body. A scream escaped her lips, echoing off the cabin walls. "That's it," Silas said, moving to her side. His hands were gentle but firm as he helped her lie back. "Don't fight it. Your body knows what to do." "I'm scared," Abigail whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Fear's natural," Silas said, laying a cool cloth on her forehead. "But you're stronger than you know, stronger than the people who abandoned you." The next few hours passed in a blur of pain and pushing, and Silas's steady presence beside her. He coached her through each contraction, his voice calm and reassuring, even when she was certain she was going to die. He told her stories to distract her from the pain tales of the mountains of the animals that lived in the high country of storms he had weathered alone in his cabin. "I had a wife once," he said during a brief lull between contractions. "Sarah. She died trying to birth our son, both of them gone in one night." Abigail's heart clenched, but she was too exhausted to offer the comfort she wanted to give. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "That was 5 years ago." Silas continued, his hands busy preparing for what was to come. Thought I'd die up here alone. Thought that's what I deserved. What changed? Abigail asked. Silas looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. Maybe nothing, maybe everything, we'll see. The first baby came as dawn was breaking, announced by a thin, reedy cry that filled the cabin with new life. Silas caught the tiny form with practiced hands, his face transformed by wonder as he cleaned the airways and wrapped the baby in soft cloth. A girl, he said, placing the bundle in Abigail's arms. Perfect, beautiful. Abigail looked down at her daughter, and felt her heart break and heal at the same time. The baby was small but perfectly formed, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with solemn intensity. Ruth. Abigail whispered the name coming from somewhere deep inside her. Her name is Ruth. Ruth, Silas repeated, testing the name. It's good, strong. The second baby followed 20 minutes later, another girl, smaller than her sister, but with lungs that could wake the dead. Silas wrapped her as carefully as he had the first, his scarred hands impossibly gentle with the tiny life. And this one? He asked, settling the second baby in Abigail's other arm. Abigail looked down at both of her daughters, these miracles that had been born in blood and snow and the kindness of a stranger. Mercy, she said. Her name is Mercy. Silas nodded approvingly. Ruth and Mercy, good names for mountain girls. As if summoned by his words, the wind outside began to howl again, reminding them that the storm was far from over. But inside the cabin, warmed by fire and the glow of new life, it felt like the safest place in the world. Abigail dozed fitfully as Silas cleaned up the evidence of the birth, her daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. She was awakened hours later by the sound of voices outside, male voices, angry and demanding. Silas Boone, we know you're in there. Send out the girl. Abigail's blood turned to ice. She knew that voice, had heard it in nightmares for months. Caleb Tate. Somehow he had found her. Silas was at the window in an instant, rifle in hand. His face was grim as he peered through the glass at the men gathered outside his cabin. How many? Abigail whispered. 3, Silas said. The boy and 2 others. Probably his father's men. What do they want? Silas's jaw tightened. You and the babies. They can't have them, Abigail said fiercely, pulling her daughters closer. These are my children. Mine. I know, Silas said, checking his rifle. And they're not getting them, not while I draw breath. Outside, Caleb's voice rose again. I'm not asking twice, mountain man. Send her out, or we'll come in and take her. Silas moved to the door, his massive frame filling the doorway as he opened it just enough to be heard. You're on my land, boy, he called out, and you're not welcome. Best you ride away while you still can. This doesn't concern you, came another voice, older, harder. Jeremiah Tate himself. The girls carrying my son's bastards. That makes them Tate blood, and Tate blood comes home. Funny, Silas said, his voice carrying clearly across the snow. The way I heard it, your boy wanted nothing to do with her or the babies. Called her names, laughed in her face when she told him. There was a moment of silence, then Jeremiah's voice again, colder than the winter wind. That was before we knew she was carrying twins. Tate blood is valuable, even bastard blood. Those children belong with family. They have family, Silas replied. They have their mother. Their mother is a whore who spread her legs for my son, Jeremiah spat. She'll raise them in poverty and shame. We can give them everything, education, opportunity, a future. Abigail felt something break inside her chest. Even now, even after everything, the Tates saw her as nothing more than a vessel for their precious bloodline. Her babies weren't daughters to them, they were possessions to be claimed. Listen carefully, Silas said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper that somehow carried perfectly through the cold air. You've got 10 seconds to get off my land. After that, I start shooting. You wouldn't dare, Caleb called out, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. My father owns half this territory. You kill us and you'll hang." "Maybe," Silas agreed, "but you'll still be dead, and your father will still be childless." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Abigail could hear the men outside talking in low, urgent voices, could sense their uncertainty. They had expected to find a defenseless girl, not a mountain man willing to kill to protect her. "This isn't over," Jeremiah called out finally. "Those children are Tate blood, and Tate blood comes home. We'll be back with more men with the law if necessary." "Law's 3 days' ride from here," Silas replied calmly, "and the storm's getting worse. Lot can happen in 3 days." There was the sound of horses moving, of men retreating, but Abigail could hear the promise in their departure. They would be back just as Jeremiah had said, and next time they would come prepared for a fight. Silas closed the door and barred it, then moved to check the windows. His face was grim as he began pulling heavy shutters closed, plunging the cabin into the warm glow of firelight. "They'll be back," Abigail said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Silas agreed, "but not today. Storm's getting worse and they'll want to plan this out. Jeremiah Tate didn't get where he is by acting in anger." "I'm sorry," Abigail said, tears threatening again. "I've brought trouble to your door. You saved my life, and now—" "Stop," Silas said firmly, settling into a chair near the fire. "You didn't bring trouble anywhere. Trouble found you, same as it finds all of us eventually. But your cabin, your home, will stand," Silas said with certainty. "I built it to last, and I've defended it before." Abigail looked down at her daughters, both sleeping peacefully, despite the chaos swirling around them. Ruth had Caleb's coloring, the golden hair and fair skin that had made him so beautiful. But Mercy was darker, with hair the color of rich earth and skin that hinted at some distant heritage. "They really think they can just take them?" she asked. Silas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Rich men like Jeremiah Tate are used to getting what they want," he said finally. "Money buys judges, sheriffs, juries, and in their minds, you're nobody, a poor farm girl who should be grateful they're even acknowledging the children." "But they're my babies," Abigail protested. "I carried them, gave birth to them, bled for them." "I know," Silas said, "and that's why they won't get them, not while I'm alive to prevent it." The certainty in his voice should have been comforting, but Abigail couldn't shake the fear that had settled in her bones. She had seen what the Tate family was capable of, had heard the stories whispered in Pine Ridge about families who had crossed them and lost everything. "Why?" she asked suddenly. "Why are you willing to risk so much for someone you just met?" Silas was quiet for so long that Abigail thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost lost in the crackling of the fire. "When Sarah died," he said, "when I lost her and our son, I thought God was punishing me for something. Thought maybe I deserved to be alone, to lose everything that mattered." He paused, his hands clenched in his lap. "I came up here to die, if I'm being honest. Figured I'd just fade away in the mountains, let the cold or the animals or the loneliness take me." "But you didn't die," Abigail observed. "No," Silas agreed. "I kept living day after day, year after year, never quite sure why." He looked at her, then his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Maybe this is why. Maybe God needed me to be here in this place at this moment to help you and your daughters." "You really believe that?" Silas shrugged. "I don't know what I believe anymore, but I know what I see: a young woman who's been abandoned by everyone, who should have protected her, fighting to save her children from people who see them as property." He stood up, moving to add another log to the fire. "And I know what I feel when I look at those babies, something I thought was dead in me." "What's that?" Abigail asked softly. "Hope," Silas said simply. "For the first time in 5 years, I feel hope." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin something warm and precious was beginning to grow. Not just the love between a mother and her children, but something larger, a family forged not by blood, but by choice, by sacrifice, by the simple human need to protect what was innocent and good. As the afternoon wore on, Silas told Abigail about his life in the mountains, how he had learned to read the weather, to track animals, to survive in conditions that would kill most men. He spoke of the peace he had found in solitude, but also of the loneliness that had nearly consumed him. "I was a different man when I came here," he said, preparing a simple meal over the fire, angry, bitter, full of rage at God and the world. "What changed you?" Abigail asked, nursing Ruth, while Mercy slept peacefully in a makeshift cradle Silas had fashioned from a wooden box and soft furs. "Time," Silas said, "and silence. You can't hold on to anger when you're surrounded by that much beauty. The mountains don't care about your pain, they just are, constant, eternal, indifferent." "That sounds lonely." "It was," Silas admitted, "but it was also healing in its way, like letting a wound scab over." Abigail studied his profile as he worked, noting the deep lines around his eyes, the scars that crossed his hands and face. This was a man who had seen violence, had perhaps dealt it out as well, but there was gentleness in him too, a tenderness that he had shown her from the moment he found her in the snow. "What will we do when they come back?" she asked. "We'll be ready," Silas said simply. "I've got food enough for weeks, ammunition for a small war, and knowledge of these mountains that goes back five years. And if that's not enough," Silas turned to look at her, his expression serious, "then we'll face whatever comes together. You're not alone anymore, Abigail, neither are your daughters." As night fell and the storm showed no signs of abating, Silas made up a bed for himself near the door, while Abigail and the babies remained by the fire. She lay awake long after he began snoring softly, staring up at the rough-hewn ceiling and trying to process everything that had happened. 24 hours ago, she had been a scared girl living under her parents' roof, carrying the children of a man who had betrayed her. Now she was a mother, a woman who had given birth in a blizzard and been saved by a stranger who asked for nothing in return. Ruth stirred in her arms, making soft sounds that weren't quite cries. Abigail looked down at her daughter's face, so perfect and new, and felt a fierce protectiveness rise in her chest. These children would never know the shame that had driven her from her family's home. They would grow up loved and wanted no matter what it cost her. "I promise," she whispered to both of her daughters. "I promise I'll protect you no matter what comes." And somewhere in the darkness she thought she heard Silas's voice, so quiet it might have been her imagination. "We promise." The wind howled outside. The snow continued to fall, and 3 people who had been strangers that morning settled into an uneasy sleep, unaware that their lives had been forever changed by a few hours of storm and blood and unexpected kindness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new choices that would test the bonds forming between them. The Tates would return as they had promised, and when they did, the real battle would begin. But tonight, in a cabin high in the Colorado mountains, hope was alive. A family had been born in the storm, and nothing, not wealth, not power, not the prejudices of a small-minded world, would tear it apart without a fight. The first thing Abigail noticed when she woke was the silence. After days of howling wind and driving snow, the sudden quiet felt almost unnatural, as if the world had been holding its breath. Pale morning light filtered through the gaps in the shutters, and she could hear Silas moving quietly around the cabin, adding wood to the fire and preparing what smelled like coffee. Ruth was nursing contentedly while Mercy slept in the crook of her other arm, both babies seemingly unaware that their world had been forever changed in the space of a single night. Abigail marveled at their peaceful faces, so innocent and trusting. They had no idea that powerful men wanted to claim them, that their very existence had sparked a conflict that could destroy everyone in this cabin. "Storms passed," Silas said softly, noticing she was awake. "For now. How long will we have?" Abigail asked, shifting carefully to avoid waking Mercy. "Hard to say. The Tates will need time to organize, gather more men. They won't underestimate this place again. Silas handed her a cup of coffee, the warmth seeping through the tin into her cold fingers. But they'll be back. Men like Jeremiah Tate don't forgive being defied. Abigail sipped the coffee gratefully, feeling the bitter warmth spread through her chest. Tell me about them. The Tates. I only know what everyone in Pine Ridge whispers. Silas settled into his chair by the fire, his expression growing dark. Jeremiah came to this territory 15 years ago with nothing but ambition and a talent for violence. Built his empire by buying out small ranchers when times were hard and when they wouldn't sell. He shrugged. Accidents happened. Barn fires, cattle poisoning, sometimes worse. The sheriff never intervened. Sheriffs on Jeremiah's payroll, same as half the territorial government. Money talks loud in these parts, and the Tates have more of it than anyone else for hundreds of miles. Abigail felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. And Caleb, apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Boy's got his father's cruelty, but none of his intelligence. Thinks his name gives him the right to take whatever he wants. Silas's voice hardened, including young women who should know better than to trust him. I was so stupid, Abigail whispered, tears threatening. So naive. He was charming and handsome, and he said all the right things, made me feel special, important. You were 17 and alone, Silas said gently, and he was a predator who knew exactly what he was doing. The fault's his, not yours. My parents didn't see it that way. Your parents were cowards who threw away the most precious thing they had to protect their reputation. The anger in Silas's voice surprised them both. Any man who would abandon his own daughter deserves whatever comes to him. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the crackle of the fire and the soft sounds the babies made as they slept. Outside, Abigail could hear the steady drip of snow melting from the eaves, the first sign that winter might eventually release its grip on the mountains. Silas, she said finally, what you said last night about your wife and son, you don't have to tell me, but Sarah was pregnant when the fever came through our settlement, he said quietly, staring into the flames. Most folks recovered, but she was weak from carrying the baby. The fever took hold and wouldn't let go. Abigail waited, sensing there was more. She fought for 3 days, Silas continued, burning up with fever but refusing to give up. I tried everything, cool cloths, willow bark, tea, prayers. I'd forgotten I knew. Nothing worked. His hands clenched into fists in his lap. The baby came during the worst of it, too early, too small. Sarah used the last of her strength to push him into the world, and then he swallowed hard. She was gone. They both were. I'm so sorry, Abigail whispered, wishing she could offer more than words. I blame myself for the longest time. Thought if I'd been a better husband, a better man, maybe God would have spared them. Maybe I could have saved them somehow. It wasn't your fault, Abigail said firmly. Fever takes who it takes. You couldn't have changed that. Silas looked at her, then something vulnerable in his dark eyes. That's what I tell myself now. Most days I even believe it. Ruth finished nursing and began making small, sleepy sounds. Silas stood and gently took her from Abigail's arms, holding the tiny baby with surprising expertise. You're good with her, Abigail observed. Had some practice, Silas said, settling Ruth in the makeshift cradle. Helped deliver foals' calves, even a few human babies back in my settlement days. Never thought I'd be doing it again. Do you miss it? Your old life? Silas considered the question. I missed the community, the feeling of belonging somewhere, but I was a different man then. Softer maybe, more trusting. What changed you? Loss, he said simply. Losing Sarah and our son broke something in me, made me realize how fragile everything we care about really is. Mercy began to stir her tiny fists, waving in the air. Abigail shifted her to nurse, marveling again at how perfectly the baby fit pet in her arms, how right it felt despite everything that had brought them to this moment. Can I ask you something? Silas said suddenly. Of course. Do you regret it? Any of it? Abigail thought about the question, about the chain of events that had led her to this cabin, trusting Caleb, getting pregnant, being cast out by her family, nearly dying in the snow. I regret trusting Caleb, she said finally. I regret believing his lies, but I don't regret Ruth and Mercy. They're the only good thing to come out of all this pain. And now, being here, Abigail met his eyes, seeing the uncertainty there, the fear that maybe he had overstepped by bringing her to his sanctuary. Being here might have saved all our lives. I'll never regret that. Something shifted in Silas's expression. A tension she hadn't even realized was there, finally releasing. They were interrupted by a sound outside, not the return of the Tates, but something else. Footsteps in the snowlight, and careful. Silas was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. But instead of moving to the window, he went to the door and opened it wide. About time, he said, and Abigail heard warmth in his voice for the first time. The woman who entered was unlike anyone Abigail had ever seen. She was perhaps 40, with the weathered skin of someone who spent her life outdoors, but her movements were graceful and sure. Her hair was black, streaked with silver, braided with small bones and feathers, and her dark eyes missed nothing as they swept the cabin. Silas, the woman said, pulling back the hood of her fur-lined cloak. I heard gunshots yesterday. Came to make sure you hadn't finally managed to shoot yourself. Not yet, Nia, Silas said, with what might have been a smile. Though the day is young. The woman called Nia noticed Abigail and the babies, then her expression shifting to one of understanding. Ah, this explains the visitors I passed on the mountain trail, 3 men riding hard despite the storm. You saw them? Silas asked sharply. From a distance. They were heading down toward the valley, but their leader, older man with silver hair, was talking about coming back with more men. Nia moved closer to Abigail, her gaze gentle but assessing. You're the one they're after. It wasn't a question, but Abigail nodded anyway. They want my babies. Think they have some claim to them. White men and their obsession with bloodlines, Nia said with disgust. As if children are cattle to be branded and owned. Nia's Ute, Silas explained, lives up in the high country, knows these mountains better than anyone. I also know healing, Nia said, settling onto the edge of the bed. May I? Abigail hesitated for only a moment before nodding. There was something about this woman that inspired trust, a calm competence that reminded her of the best midwives she had known. Nia's examination was thorough but gentle, her hands skilled as she checked both babies and assessed Abigail's condition. You did well, she told Silas when she was finished. Both mother and children are healthy. Will they stay that way? Abigail asked. The babies, I mean, are they strong enough? They're fighters, Nia said with certainty, like their mother, but they'll need time to grow strong, and you'll need time to heal properly. Time we might not have, Silas said grimly. Nia studied his face. How bad is it? Bad. The man who fathered these children is Caleb Tate. His father Jeremiah claims their family blood and wants them back. Jeremiah Tate. Nia's voice went flat. I know that name. His men killed my brother's horses last summer when he refused to sell his land. I'm sorry, Abigail said softly. Don't be sorry for things that aren't your fault, Nia replied firmly. Save your sorrow for things that matter. She stood and began unpacking a leather satchel she had carried with her. I brought supplies, herbs for healing, food that will help your milk come in strong, and this. She pulled out a bundle wrapped in soft leather, setting it carefully on the table. When she unwrapped it, Abigail gasped. Inside was the most beautiful knife she had ever seen, its blade polished to mirror brightness, its handle carved with intricate designs. It was my grandmother's, Nia said. She carried it when she fled the soldiers, when they tried to take her children to the white schools. It's been blessed by 3 generations of women who refuse to let their babies be stolen. I can't take this, Abigail protested. You're not taking it, I'm giving it to you. Nia's dark eyes were serious. Jeremiah Tate thinks you're helpless because you're young and alone. Show him that even cornered mothers have teeth. Silas cleared his throat. Nia, what's the word from the settlements? Any talk of what the Tates are planning? Nothing specific, but they've been hiring men. Drifters, mostly. The kind who ask no questions as long as the pay is good. Nia began preparing something that smelled like medicinal tea. My guess is they'll wait for the weather to clear completely, then come back with enough force to overwhelm any resistance. How long do we have? Abigail asked. 3 days, maybe 4 if we're lucky, Nia said, but they'll come prepared for a siege this time. The 3 adults fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Silas spoke. We could leave. Take the babies and head deeper into the mountains. I know places where no one would find us. Run forever? Abigail asked. Never able to settle anywhere, always looking over our shoulders. Better than the alternative. Is it though? Abigail looked down at her daughters, both sleeping peacefully despite the tension filling the cabin. What kind of life would that be for them? Always hiding, always afraid. A life where they're free, Silas said simply. Free to do what live like fugitives, never know stability or community or the simple pleasure of belonging somewhere. Nia watched the exchange with interest. There's wisdom in both views. Sometimes running is the only way to survive, but sometimes you have to make a stand even when the odds are impossible. What would you do? Abigail asked her. I'd fight, Nia said without hesitation. But then I've been fighting powerful white men my whole life. It's in my blood. It's not in mine, Abigail admitted. I've never fought anyone for anything. I've always just accepted what happened to me. Then maybe it's time to learn, Silas said quietly, because those babies deserve a mother who won't let them be taken without a fight. Something in his words sparked anger in Abigail's chest, not at him, but at herself, at all the times she had been passive, accepting, grateful for scraps of affection and kindness, at the way she had let Caleb use her and discard her, at how she had meekly followed her parents into the snow without fighting for her own life. You're right, she said, her voice growing stronger. I'm tired of being a victim, tired of letting other people decide what happens to me and my children. Good, Nia said with approval. Anger is useful if you channel it properly. Teach me, Abigail said suddenly. Both of you, teach me how to fight. Silas and Nia exchanged glances. Fighting's not just about weapons, Silas warned. It's about being willing to do whatever it takes to protect what matters to you. Are you ready for that? Abigail thought about Ruth and Mercy, about the love that already burned so fiercely in her chest that it sometimes frightened her. Yes, she said, I'm ready. The next 3 days passed in intensive preparation. Nia taught Abigail how to use the knife, how to strike quickly and effectively, how to find the vulnerable points on a man's body. Silas showed her how to load and fire his rifles, how to barricade the cabin, how to move silently in the snow. But more importantly, they taught her about strategy, about thinking ahead, about turning disadvantages into advantages, about using an enemy's assumptions against them. They'll expect you to be helpless, Nia explained as they worked together to prepare medical supplies. Use that. Let them think you're weak and frightened right up until the moment you prove them wrong. Jeremiah's smart, but he's also arrogant, Silas added. He thinks money and numbers can solve any problem. That arrogance will be his weakness. Abigail absorbed it all, feeling herself changing with each lesson. The frightened girl who had crawled through the snow was still there, but she was being joined by someone harder, someone who understood that love sometimes required violence to protect it. On the third night, as they sat around the fire cleaning weapons and checking supplies one final time, Nia asked the question that had been hovering unspoken between them. What happens after? She said. If we survive this, what then? Abigail looked at Silas, seeing the same uncertainty in his eyes that she felt in her heart. They had been thrown together by circumstance, bonded by crisis. But what would hold them together once the immediate danger had passed? I don't know, Abigail said honestly. I don't know anything about the future anymore. Maybe that's enough for now, Silas said quietly. Maybe it's enough to know that we'll face whatever comes together. Together, Naya agreed, raising her cup of coffee in a mock toast. 3 broken people who found each other in a storm. Are we broken? Abigail asked. We were, Naya said, but broken things can be mended if you find the right hands to do it. They were interrupted by a sound outside, not the wind this time, but something else. The soft whinny of a horse, quickly muffled. Silas was on his feet instantly, moving to the window, with practiced silence. They're here, he whispered. More than before, I count at least 6 men, maybe more, in the trees. Abigail's heart began to race, but her hands remained steady as she checked the knife at her belt and picked up the rifle Silas had taught her to use. Mercy was nursing, but Ruth was awake and alert in her cradle, as if she, too, sensed the danger approaching. Remember, Naya whispered, they think you're helpless. Use that. What if I can't? Abigail asked. What if when the moment comes, I freeze? Silas moved to her side, his large hand warm on her shoulder. Then we'll all freeze together, but I don't think you will. I think you're stronger than you know. Outside, Jeremiah Tate's voice cut through the night air, cold and commanding. Silas Boone, we've come for what's ours. Send out the girl and the babies, and no one else has to die. Silas looked at Abigail, a question in his eyes. She took a deep breath, thinking of her daughters, of all the ways this could end. Then she nodded. We're ready, she said, and was surprised by the steel in her own voice. Silas opened the door just wide enough to be heard. Same answer as before, Tate, you're not welcome here. I brought the territorial marshal this time, Jeremiah called back. Legal papers saying those children are my son's bastards and belong with their father's family. Convenient how the law always seems to favor the highest bidder, Silas replied. But papers don't change facts. Those babies have a mother, and she says they're staying right here. The mother's a whore who seduced my son. Caleb's voice joined his father's high and petulant. She has no legal claim to children of Tate blood. Something cold and hard settled in Abigail's chest at the sound of his voice. The voice that had once whispered lies about love and forever. She moved to the door, gently pushing Silas aside. Hello, Caleb, she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the snow. Still hiding behind your father, I see. There was a moment of stunned silence, then Caleb's voice again, uncertain now. Abby, you're alive. Disappointed. No, of course not. We were worried when your parents said you'd run away. Liar, the word came out flat and hard. We both know what really happened. We both know what you said when I told you about the babies. I was just surprised. I needed time to think. You had 9 months to think, plenty of time to do the right thing. Abigail's voice grew stronger. But you didn't, did you? You laughed, called me names, said you'd never marry someone like me. Enough of this. Jeremiah's voice cut through his son's stammering. Girl, you've had your say. Now come out before we come in and take what's ours by force. Try it, Abigail said simply. And then the shooting began. The first John Sphere's shot shattered the window nearest the door, sending glass flying across the cabin. Silas returned fire immediately, his rifle booming in the enclosed space. Naya had taken position at the back window, her own weapon trained on the shadows moving between the trees. Stay low, Silas shouted over the noise. Keep the babies down. Abigail crouched beside the cradle, one hand on Ruth to keep her calm, the other gripping her rifle. Her heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear anything else, but her hands remained steady. More shots came splintering the thick log walls, filling the air with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Someone was shouting orders outside, Jeremiah's voice, cold and commanding even in the chaos. Circle around the back. Mason, take 2 men to the left side. Nobody shoots until I give the word. They're trying to surround us, Naya called out. Let them, Silas replied grimly. This cabin's been my fortress for 5 years. I know every inch of it. A shadow moved past the shattered window, and Abigail found herself raising her rifle without conscious thought. The man was young, maybe not much older than her, with nervous eyes and hands that shook as he tried to peer into the cabin. I can see one of them, she whispered to Silas. Take the shot if you have a clear one, he said. But remember, once you pull that trigger, there's no going back. Abigail sighted down the barrel, her finger resting on the trigger. The young man was so close she could see the sweat on his face, despite the cold. He was someone's son, maybe someone's brother, but he was also here to take her children. She pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and the young man spun away from the window with a cry of pain. She had hit him in the shoulder, not a killing shot, but enough to put him out of the fight. Well done, Silas said grimly. First blood to us. But their advantage was short-lived. More shots came from multiple directions now, the attackers having spread out around the cabin. A bullet punched through the back wall near Nia's head, and she ducked with a curse. Getting closer, she reported, and they're learning our positions. Time to move, Silas said. He began pulling heavy furniture away from a section of the floor, revealing a trapdoor Abigail hadn't known existed. Root cellar. It connects to a tunnel that comes out near the barn. You planned for this, Abigail realized. I planned for everything, Silas confirmed. Now move, take the babies, and get down there. What about you? We'll hold them here as long as we can, then follow. Go. Abigail gathered Ruth and Mercy, wrapping them tightly in furs to protect them from the cold below. The root cellar was dark and cramped, carved out of the rocky soil beneath the cabin. She could hear the gunfight continuing above her, the sound of boots on the floor, voices shouting commands. A few minutes later, Naya dropped through the trapdoor, followed by Silas. His left arm was bleeding from a graze, but his eyes were still hard and determined. They're in the cabin, he said shortly. Won't take them long to figure out where we went. They moved through the tunnel in darkness, Silas leading the way by memory. The babies remained mercifully quiet, as if they sensed the danger surrounding them. Behind them, Abigail could hear voices in the cabin, angry and frustrated. The tunnel emerged in the barn behind a stack of hay bales that had hidden the entrance. Silas pushed them aside and helped Abigail climb out, the babies still secure in her arms. Now what? She whispered. Now we disappear, Silas said. I've got supplies cached in 3 different locations. We can... He was interrupted by the sound of the barn door creaking open. Light spilled across the floor as armed men entered, led by Jeremiah Tate himself. In the lamplight, Abigail could see the cold fury in the older man's eyes. Clever, Jeremiah said approvingly, but not clever enough. They were surrounded. 6 men with rifles trained on them, with no cover and nowhere to run. Abigail looked down at her daughters, so small and helpless in her arms, and felt despair begin to creep into her heart. It's over, Jeremiah continued. Give us the children and we'll let you live to walk away. And if we refuse? Silas asked. Jeremiah's smile was cold as winter wind. Then you die here and we take them anyway. The silence in the barn stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the soft whisper of snow against the walls and the quiet breathing of the babies in Abigail's arms. 6 rifle barrels gleamed in the lamplight, all pointed at the 3 figures huddled near the hidden tunnel entrance. Jeremiah Tate stood at the center of his men, like a general surveying a conquered battlefield, his silver hair catching the light, his eyes cold as mountain stones. Well, he said, his voice deceptively calm. I'm waiting for an answer. Abigail felt Silas tense beside her, saw Naya's hand inch toward the knife at her belt. But they were outnumbered 2 to 1, caught in the open, with nowhere to run. Any move they made would end in bloodshed, and her daughters would be caught in the crossfire. You have your answer, Silas said quietly. Same as before. Jeremiah's smile never wavered, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. I was hoping you'd be reasonable, save everyone a lot of trouble. Trouble? Nia spoke for the first time since entering the barn, her voice sharp with contempt. The only trouble here is you, old man, taking children from their mother like some kind of animal. Watch your tongue, squaw, one of Jeremiah's men snarled, swinging his rifle toward her. The word hung in the air like a slap. Nia's eyes went flat and deadly, and Abigail saw her shift almost imperceptibly, preparing to strike despite the hopeless odds. Easy, Pike, Jeremiah said mildly, though his tone carried a warning. No need for unpleasantness. We're all civilized people here. Civilized, Abigail found her voice at last and was surprised by the strength in it. You call it civilized to steal babies from their mother. I call it practical, Jeremiah replied. Those children carry Tate blood. That makes them valuable, more valuable than you can possibly understand. They're not property, Abigail said fiercely. They're my daughters. Your daughters. Caleb stepped forward from behind his father, his handsome face twisted with an emotion Abigail couldn't quite read. You think I'd claim bastards sired on a fat farm girl? The words hit like physical blows, but instead of crumpling under them, as she once might have, Abigail felt something hard and cold settle in her chest. Then why are you here, Caleb? If they mean nothing to you, why not let us disappear into the mountains? Caleb's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. It was Jeremiah who answered his voice, matter of fact. Because Tate blood is Tate blood, regardless of the vessel that carried it. These children will be raised as Tates, educated as Tates, and marry into families that benefit the Tate name. Over my dead body, Abigail said simply. That can be arranged, Jeremiah replied with chilling calm. Ruth chose that moment to wake her tiny voice, rising in a thin cry that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. Abigail automatically began to rock her murmuring soft words of comfort. And for just an instant, every man in the barn found himself looking at the baby instead of the weapons. It was the opening Nia had been waiting for. She moved like lightning, her grandmother's knife appearing in her hand as if by magic. But instead of attacking the nearest gunman, she did something that shocked everyone in the barn. She pressed the blade to her own throat. One more step and I cut my own throat, she said calmly. And when I do, I take the location of 3 other tunnel systems with me, systems that Silas here doesn't know about. Jeremiah's eyes narrowed. You're bluffing. Am I? Nia's smile was sharp as her blade. I've lived in these mountains since before you were born, white man. Every cave, every passage, every hidden trail, I know them all. Kill us here and you'll never find all the ways in and out of this valley. So what? One of the gunmen growled. We got what we came for. Do you? Nia's gaze fixed on Jeremiah. Tell me, how do you plan to get those babies down the mountain in this weather? They're newborns barely 3 days old. The cold will kill them before you reach the valley. Jeremiah's confident expression flickered for the first time. We brought blanket supplies. Blankets won't save them if they get too cold too fast, Nia continued relentlessly. And it's a 2-day ride to the nearest settlement with a wet nurse. 2 days in winter weather with babies who need their mother's milk every few hours. Abigail saw the truth of it register on Jeremiah's face, saw him realize the flaw in his carefully laid plans. In his arrogance, he had assumed taking the babies would be the hard part. He hadn't considered what came after. Then the girl comes too, he said finally, just until we reach civilization. And then what? Silas asked. You let her go. Jeremiah's silence was answer enough. You mean to kill her, Nia said flatly. Once the babies are weaned, she becomes a liability. She became a liability the moment she spread her legs for my son, Jeremiah replied coldly. But I'm not unreasonable, I'll make it quick. The casual way he spoke of murder made Abigail's stomach turn. This was the man who had raised Caleb, who had taught him that people were objects to be used and discarded. No wonder his son had been able to seduce and abandon her without a second thought. "There's another option," a new voice said from the barn entrance. Everyone turned to see a figure silhouetted against the snowy night, tall, lean, dressed in the dark clothing of a traveling preacher. He stepped into the lamplight, revealing a weathered face, dominated by intelligent gray eyes and a mouth set in grim lines. "Brother Matthews," Jeremiah said, and Abigail heard genuine surprise in his voice. "What are you doing here?" "Following rumors," the preacher said mildly, his gaze taking in the scene before him. "Word's been spreading through the settlements about a rich man's son abandoning a pregnant girl to die in a blizzard. Thought I might be needed." "This is none of your concern, preacher," Jeremiah said, but some of the authority had gone out of his voice. "Isn't it?" Brother Matthews moved deeper into the barn, seemingly oblivious to the guns trained on him. "Seems to me that any matter involving the welfare of children is very much my concern." He stopped in front of Abigail, his eyes kind, as he looked down at the babies in her arms. "Beautiful children," he said softly. "They have their father's coloring, I see." "How would you know?" Caleb demanded. Brother Matthews reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document yellow with age. "Because I was there when you married their mother's son, witnessed the ceremony myself." The words hit the barn like a thunderclap. Every man present went perfectly still, the implications sinking in like stones through water. "That's impossible," Jeremiah said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Is it?" Brother Matthews unfolded the document with careful hands. October 15th, 1874, Caleb Jeremiah Tate and Abigail Rose Puitt joined in holy matrimony before God and witnesses in the settlement of Cedar Falls. "No," Caleb whispered, his face going white. We were just playing. It wasn't real." "You said the words," Brother Matthews replied calmly. "You exchanged rings such as they were. You signed the certificate. In the eyes of God and the territorial law, it was as real as any marriage performed in the finest church." Abigail stared at the preacher in shock. She remembered that day, remembered how Caleb had convinced her it would be romantic to have a pretend wedding in the little cabin where Brother Matthews was staying, how he had promised it was just for fun, just between them, a sweet game that lovers played. "The marriage was never consummated," Jeremiah said desperately. "Without consummation, it's not legal." Brother Matthews looked pointedly at the babies in Abigail's arms. "Those children suggest otherwise." "But the bans were never published," one of the gunmen offered. "Don't marriages have to be announced?" "In settled areas, yes," Brother Matthews agreed. "But in the territories, a preacher has the authority to perform marriages without formal announcements, especially in cases where the couple might face danger from hostile family members." His eyes fixed on Jeremiah with that last comment, and the older man's face flushed with anger. "You're saying my son is married to this nobody. I'm saying your son has been married for over a year to a young woman who is now the mother of his legitimate children," Brother Matthews corrected, "which makes those babies your legal heirs, not bastards to be stolen in the night." The silence that followed was deafening. Abigail could see the calculations running behind Jeremiah's eyes, the rapid reassessment of his position. If the babies were legitimate heirs, taking them from their mother became kidnapping under territorial law. And while Jeremiah might own the local sheriff, he couldn't control every judge and marshal in the territory. "This changes nothing," he said finally, but the words lacked conviction. "Doesn't it?" Brother Matthews smiled coldly. "Your daughter-in-law has been abandoned by her husband, cast out by her family, forced to give birth in a blizzard. I'd say she has grounds for quite a substantial settlement, wouldn't you?" "Settlement?" Caleb squeaked. "Oh yes," the preacher continued conversationally. "Abandonment, emotional distress, endangerment of mother and children. A good territorial judge might award her half of your family's holdings." Jeremiah's face had gone purple with rage. "You sanctimonious fool! Do you have any idea who you're threatening?" A man who just tried to kidnap his own grandchildren. Brother Matthews replied calmly. I imagine the territorial governor would be very interested to hear about that. The governor's a friend of mine. Not anymore. The preacher's smile turned sharp. Funny thing about politicians, they have a way of forgetting old friendships when scandal threatens their careers. Abigail watched the exchange with growing amazement. In the space of a few minutes, Brother Matthews had completely transformed the situation. Instead of being victims to be robbed and murdered, she and her children had become legitimate heirs with legal claims that could destroy the Tate empire. You're bluffing, Jeremiah said, but doubt had crept into his voice. Am I? Brother Matthews folded the marriage certificate carefully and returned it to his coat. Would you like to test that theory? Because I have several copies of this document lodged with judges in 3 different territories. If anything happens to this young woman or her children, those copies will find their way to very interested parties. The standoff stretched out tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. Abigail could see Jeremiah weighing his options, calculating risks and benefits with the cold precision of a man who had built an empire through careful planning and ruthless execution. Finally, he spoke. What do you want? Nothing I don't already have, Brother Matthews replied. Mrs. Tate, and that is her legal name, now wishes to live peacefully with her children. You will leave them alone. And if I refuse, then tomorrow morning I ride to the territorial capital with a very interesting story about attempted kidnapping and murder. I doubt your political friends will be able to help you with federal charges. Jeremiah's jaw worked silently, rage and frustration warring with pragmatic calculation. Abigail held her breath, afraid to hope that this nightmare might actually be ending. This isn't over, Jeremiah said finally, his voice low and deadly. Family blood calls to family blood. Those children belong with us. Those children belong with their mother, Brother Matthews corrected. Who is legally speaking your daughter-in-law? Never, Caleb burst out. I'll never acknowledge her as my wife. That's your choice, the preacher said calmly. But the law is the law, regardless of your personal feelings. Jeremiah gestured sharply to his men. We're leaving, but this conversation isn't finished. Oh, but it is, Brother Matthews said. Unless you want to explain to a federal marshal why you're threatening a legally married woman and her legitimate children. The gunmen began filing out of the barn, their weapons finally lowered. Caleb lingered for a moment, his face a mask of confused anger and wounded pride. This isn't what I wanted, he said to Abigail, and for the first time she heard something that might have been genuine regret in his voice. I know, she replied quietly, but it's what we got. He stared at her for a long moment, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Then he turned and followed his father into the night. Jeremiah was the last to leave, pausing in the doorway to deliver one final threat. This won't hold, you know. Papers can be lost, witnesses can disappear. I built an empire in this territory, and I didn't do it by accepting defeat. Maybe, Brother Matthews agreed, but empires fall too, Mr. Tate, usually when they're built on foundations of injustice and cruelty. Jeremiah's eyes promised retribution, but he said nothing more. A moment later, the sound of horses departing echoed through the night, growing fainter, until it was swallowed by the whisper of falling snow. The barn fell silent except for the soft sounds of the babies and the distant crackling of the fire in the cabin. Abigail felt her legs give out suddenly, weak with relief and delayed shock. Silas caught her before she could fall, his strong arms supporting her, as the weight of what had just happened finally hit her. It's over, she whispered. Is it really over? For now, Brother Matthews said gently, though I suspect Mr. Tate wasn't entirely wrong about this not being finished. The marriage certificate, Abigail said suddenly. Is it real? Brother Matthews met her eyes, and she saw a mixture of kindness and sadness there. As real as any document can be. I perform many marriages in the territory's child. Some are love matches, some are arrangements of convenience, and some, he paused, some are protections against predators. You knew, she realized. Even then you knew what kind of man Caleb was. I suspected. He had a reputation even then, but you were young and trusting, and he was skilled at deception. The preacher's expression hardened. I've seen too many girls ruined by men like him. When the opportunity arose to give you some legal protection, I took it, but I signed the certificate too, Abigail said, confused. I remember signing it. You did, but I never explained the legal implications, and Caleb convinced you it was just a game. Brother Matthews smiled sadly. Sometimes child adults have to make decisions for children who can't yet see the dangers around them. Nia had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. You planned this, she said to the preacher, all of it. I planned for the possibility, Brother Matthews corrected. When word reached me that Caleb had abandoned a pregnant girl to die in a blizzard, I knew it was time to reveal certain truths. How did you know where to find us? Silas asked. I've been tracking the Tate party for 2 days. When I saw them heading up into the mountains with enough firepower for a small war, it wasn't hard to guess their destination. The preacher looked around the barn, taking in the signs of recent violence. I only wish I'd arrived sooner. You arrived exactly when you were needed, Abigail said firmly. Any sooner and Jeremiah might not have revealed his true intentions. Any later and... She didn't finish the sentence, but they all understood. A few more minutes and the confrontation would have ended in bloodshed. What happens now? Silas asked. Jeremiah's not the type to accept defeat gracefully. Now we make sure he can't try this again, Brother Matthews replied. I have copies of the marriage certificate, as I said, but we need to do more. File the documents with the territorial government, establish a legal record that can't be easily challenged or destroyed. And then, Abigail asked, then you live your life, child. Raise your daughters, find happiness where you can. You're free now, legally free from your parents' authority, legally protected from the Tate's schemes. Free. Abigail repeated the word like she was tasting something foreign. I don't think I've ever been free before. Freedom's a burden as much as a blessing, Nia observed. Now all your choices are your own to make. And your mistakes too, Silas added quietly. Abigail looked at him, seeing uncertainty in his dark eyes. The crisis that had brought them together was over, and now they had to figure out what came next. 3 people who had been strangers a week ago, bound together by circumstance and shared danger, but with no clear path forward. I should go, Brother Matthews said, breaking the awkward silence. I have a long ride ahead of me and documents to file. Wait, Abigail said. I don't know how to thank you. You saved our lives tonight. You saved your own lives, the preacher corrected. I just provided some useful paperwork. He moved toward the barn door, then paused. One more thing, child. That marriage certificate makes you Caleb's legal wife, but it doesn't make you his property. You have the right to live apart from him, to raise your children as you see fit. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Even the law, especially the law, Brother Matthews said with a slight smile. The law is a tool, nothing more. How you use it depends on your courage and your will. After he left, the 3 of them stood in the barn for a long moment, processing everything that had happened. Ruth had fallen back asleep, but Mercy was awake and alert, her dark eyes seeming to take in everything around her with solemn attention. We should get back to the cabin, Silas said finally. Clean up the damage, see what can be salvaged. The cabin bore the scars of the recent battle, shattered windows, bullet holes in the walls, furniture overturned and scattered. But the structure was sound, and the fire was still burning in the hearth. It would take work to make it comfortable again, but it was still a home. I can help with repairs, Nia offered as they surveyed the damage. Got nowhere else to be for a while. You don't have to, Abigail said. You've already done so much. Haven't done nearly enough, Nia replied firmly. Besides, those babies will need protection while they grow. One man, even one as capable as Silas, can't watch every approach to this valley. And what about after? Silas asked the question that had been hovering unspoken since Brother Matthews left. When the babies are older, when the immediate danger has passed. Abigail looked around the cabin, this place that had been her sanctuary, her daughter's birthplace, the scene of so much fear and joy and violence. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had ever owned before. I don't know, she said honestly. I've never had to plan a future before. My parents planned everything for me, and then Caleb, I thought he was planning our future together. Maybe that's enough for now, Silas suggested. Maybe it's enough to know that we've got through today. Is it, though? Abigail asked. We can't live one day at a time forever. The girls will need stability, education, a chance to build lives of their own. They'll have all of that, Nia said confidently. Maybe not in the way you originally imagined, but they'll have it. How can you be so sure? Nia smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. Because they have something more valuable than money or social position. They have a mother who would die for them and friends who would kill for them. That's a stronger foundation than most children ever get. Outside, the wind was picking up again, promising another storm. But inside the cabin, warmed by fire and the presence of people who cared for each other, the future seemed less frightening than it had just hours before. Abigail settled into the chair by the fire, nursing Mercy, while Ruth slept peacefully in her cradle. Silas was already beginning to clean up the damage, his movements efficient and sure. Nia was preparing tea, humming softly under her breath. Thank you, Abigail said suddenly. Both of you. I know I keep saying it, but stop, Silas said gently. You don't owe us gratitude. We're family now. Family, Abigail repeated, testing the word. I like the sound of that. Better get used to it, Nia said with a grin, because families stick together through good times and bad, even when things get complicated. Especially then, Silas said. Family's not about blood or law or tradition. It's about choice, about deciding that someone else's welfare matters as much as your own. Abigail felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears for once. Tears of relief and gratitude and something that might have been hope. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged. The storm outside continued to rage, but it no longer seemed threatening. Let it blow. Let the snow pile higher and the wind howl louder. Inside this cabin, protected by love and determination and the fierce loyalty of chosen family, they would weather whatever came, and tomorrow, when the storm passed, they would begin the work of building a life together, not perfect perhaps, but honest and real and entirely their own. The weeks that followed passed in a rhythm of healing and rebuilding that surprised Abigail with its quiet contentment. Each morning brought new evidence that life was slowly returning to normal, if anything about their unconventional family could be called normal. Silas worked steadily to repair the damage from the siege, replacing shattered windows with oiled paper until proper glass could be brought up from the valley, patching bullet holes with fresh logs, and reinforcing the cabin's defenses in ways that wouldn't be obvious to casual observers. Nia had settled into the routine as if she had always belonged there, her presence bringing a different kind of strength to their small community. She knew herbs that helped Abigail's milk come in rich and strong teas that eased the aches of new motherhood, and countless practical skills that made their isolated life more comfortable. But more than that, she brought laughter, something Abigail realized had been missing from her life longer than she cared to admit. You're thinking too hard again, Nia observed one afternoon as they worked together preparing preserves from the last of Silas's stored apples. Ruth was sleeping peacefully in a basket nearby, while Mercy nursed in Abigail's arms. Am I? Abigail asked, startled from her reverie. You get this little line right here. Nia touched her own forehead between her eyebrows. When you're worrying about things that haven't happened yet. I can't help it. Everything feels so temporary, like it could all disappear if I'm not careful enough. Naya's hands never paused in their work, but her voice grew gentle. That's what fear does to us. Makes us think that if we just worry hard enough, we can control what comes next. Can't we, though? At least a little. Some things, yes. Others? Naya shrugged. Others are like weather. You can prepare for storms, but you can't stop them from coming. Through the window, Abigail could see Silas working in the barn, his movements economical and sure. Over the past weeks, she had watched him slowly emerge from the shell of solitude he had built around himself. He talked more now, smiled occasionally, and had even begun telling stories of his life before the mountains, carefully edited stories that revealed glimpses of the man he had been before grief changed him. "Can I ask you something?" Abigail said to Nia. "Always. Do you think he's happy, Silas, having us here disrupting his quiet life?" Nia looked up from her work, studying Abigail with knowing eyes. "Why don't you ask him?" "Because I'm afraid of the answer." "Ah," Nia smiled. "And what if the answer is yes? What then?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Abigail wasn't ready to examine too closely. What would it mean if Silas was happy to have them there? What would it mean if she was happy to be there? The marriage certificate in Brother Matthew's possession might make her legally Caleb's wife, but it didn't make her feel married. If anything, it felt like a shield legal protection that had nothing to do with her heart. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. All three adults froze, the peaceful afternoon suddenly charged with tension. Silas appeared in the doorway, rifle in hand, his face grim. "Two riders," he said quietly, "coming up the main trail." "Tate's?" Naya asked, already moving toward her weapons. "Can't tell yet. They're still too far out." Abigail felt the familiar flutter of panic in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. Ruth and Mercy needed her steady, not frightened. She moved to the window, careful to stay out of sight, and watched as the figures emerged from the tree line. "It's all right," she said with relief. "One of them is Brother Matthews." Sure enough, the traveling preacher rode into the clearing a few minutes later, accompanied by a woman Abigail didn't recognize. She was perhaps 30, with graying hair and practical clothes, riding her horse with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to long journeys. "Brother Matthews," Silas called out, lowering his rifle. "Welcome back." "Silas, my friend." The preacher dismounted with obvious weariness. "I bring news and I bring help." He gestured to his companion, who was already swinging down from her saddle with practiced ease. "This is Mrs. Catherine Holloway. She's a teacher from the territorial capital, and she's agreed to spend some time with us." "A teacher?" Abigail stepped outside, curious, despite her caution. Mrs. Holloway approached with a warm smile, her gray eyes taking in the scene with quick intelligence. "Mrs. Tate," she said, extending her hand, "I've heard a great deal about you." The use of her legal name still felt strange, but Abigail shook the offered hand gratefully. "Please call me Abigail, and these are my daughters Ruth and Mercy." "Beautiful children," Mrs. Holloway said, her voice soft with genuine warmth. "Brother Matthews tells me they're quite remarkable." "All children are remarkable," Abigail replied. "But yes, they're special to me, as they should be." Mrs. Holloway's gaze moved to include Silas and Nia. "And this is the family that's been caring for them." "Family," Nia repeated with satisfaction. "I like that word." Brother Matthews cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should go inside. I have news to share, and Mrs. Holloway has traveled a long way to be here." They gathered around the fire as they had so many times before, but the addition of two newcomers changed the dynamic somehow, made their small circle feel more connected to the world beyond the mountains. First, Brother Matthews began the legal situation. "I've filed all the necessary documents with the territorial government. Your marriage to Caleb Tate is now a matter of official record, which means your daughters are legally recognized as Tate heirs." "What does that mean, practically speaking?" Silas asked. It means that if anything happens to Caleb or if he dies without other legitimate children, Ruth and Mercy would inherit his share of the Tate holdings. Abigail felt a chill at the implications. Jeremiah won't like that. No, he won't, Brother Matthews agreed. Which brings me to my second piece of news. Jeremiah has been making inquiries about having the marriage annulled. Can he do that? Naya asked sharply. He can try, but annulment requires proof that the marriage was invalid, from the beginning fraud, coercion, or mental incapacity. Since none of those apply, he'd have a difficult time making his case. What about divorce? Abigail asked. Divorce is complicated in the territories, expensive, time-consuming, and often scandalous for all parties involved. Most judges are reluctant to grant them without overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing. Mrs. Holloway spoke for the first time since they'd entered the cabin. There may be another option, though it's not without risks. All eyes turned to her, and she continued carefully. The territorial government is always in need of qualified teachers, especially in remote areas. If Mrs. Tate were to accept a teaching position, it would give her an independent income and legal standing that would be very difficult for the Tate family to challenge. A teaching position. Abigail's heart leaped at the possibility. But I'm not qualified. I've never taught anyone except my own children, and they're still babies. You can read and write, can't you? Mrs. Holloway asked with a smile. Do arithmetic, that's more qualification than most frontier teachers start with. But the babies would come with you naturally. Frontier schools are accustomed to accommodating teachers' children. It's often the only way to get anyone to take the position. Abigail looked around the circle, seeing encouragement in every face. Where would this position be? That's the beauty of it, Brother Matthews said. There's a settlement about 20 miles south of here, Cedar Falls. Small community, mostly farming families desperately in need of a teacher. Close enough that you could maintain connections here, but far enough to give you independence. Independence, Abigail repeated softly. The word tasted like freedom on her tongue. It wouldn't be easy, Mrs. Holloway warned. Frontier teaching is demanding work, and single mothers face additional challenges, but it would be yours, your life, your choices, your future. What about Silas and Nia? Abigail asked. I can't just abandon the people who saved my life. You wouldn't be abandoning anyone, Silas said quietly. You'd be building a life for yourself and your daughters. That's what we've all wanted from the beginning. But Abigail heard something in his voice, a careful neutrality that might have been hiding disappointment, or maybe she was imagining it, projecting her own conflicted feelings onto him. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course, Mrs. Holloway replied. These decisions shouldn't be rushed. I'll be staying in the area for several weeks, helping to establish the school. Take all the time you need. The conversation moved on to other topics. News from the settlement's changes in territorial law, gossip about mutual acquaintances. But Abigail found herself only half listening, her mind spinning with possibilities and fears in equal measure. That evening, after their guests had been settled in the barn for the night, Abigail found herself unable to sleep. She rose quietly, careful not to wake the babies, and stepped outside into the crisp mountain air. The sky was brilliant with stars unmarred by clouds or the glow of distant cities. Couldn't sleep either. She turned to find Silas emerging from the shadows near the cabin wall. In the starlight, his face was all planes and angles, his expression unreadable. Too much to think about, she admitted. The teaching position, among other things. She wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. It's a good opportunity. A chance for independence for Ruth and Mercy, to grow up with other children, for me to contribute something meaningful to the world. It is, Silas agreed. Mrs. Holloway seems like a good woman. She'd help you get established, make sure you had what you needed. But Silas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks. No buts. It's a good opportunity and you should take it. Then why do you sound like you're talking yourself into something? He turned to look at her then, and in the starlight she could see the conflict in his eyes. Because I'm selfish enough to want you to stay, and honest enough to know that's not what's best for you. The admission hung between them like a bridge that could be crossed or burned. Abigail felt her heart begin to race, not with fear this time, but with something else entirely. "What if I don't know what's best for me?" she asked softly. "What if I've spent so much of my life letting other people make my choices that I don't trust my own judgment anymore?" Then you learn to trust it, one decision at a time, one day at a time. And if I make mistakes, then you make mistakes. They're yours to make. Abigail moved closer to him, close enough to see the way the starlight caught in his dark hair, close enough to smell the familiar scent of wood smoke and mountain air that clung to his clothes. "What would you choose?" she asked. "If you were in my position, I can't answer that. I'm not you, and I don't have your responsibilities. But if you were—" Silas sighed, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "I spent 5 years running away from the world, convinced that isolation was the same thing as safety. It took finding you in that snowstorm to realize that I wasn't protecting myself. I was just slowly dying inside. And now I'm alive again. Because of you, because of Ruth and Mercy, because of this strange family we've built together." He looked at her directly, his eyes intense. "But that doesn't mean I have the right to ask you to give up your chance at a real future for my sake." "What if it's not just for your sake?" Abigail asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I want to stay because this feels like home in a way nowhere else ever has?" The silence stretched between them, filled with possibilities neither of them had dared to voice before. Finally, Silas reached out and gently touched her face, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against her skin. "Then stay," he said simply. "Stay, and we'll figure out everything else as we go. Even though I'm legally married to another man, papers don't make a marriage, Abigail. Hearts do, and my heart has been yours since the moment I saw you fighting for your children's lives in that barn." The kiss that followed was nothing like the clumsy fumbling she had experienced with Caleb. This was gentle and sure and filled with a depth of feeling that took her breath away. When they finally broke apart, Abigail felt as though something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of what love could be. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. "I think I have for weeks, but I was too afraid to admit it." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid that it was just gratitude. Afraid that you were just being kind. Afraid that I was making the same mistake I made with Caleb." "This isn't the same," Silas said firmly. "Caleb was a boy playing games. What I feel for you, what we have together, this is real." They stood together in the starlight, holding each other against the mountain cold, both of them finally admitting the truth they had been dancing around for weeks. But their moment of peace was shattered by the sound of a baby crying from inside the cabin. "Mercy," Abigail said, immediately stepping back toward the door. "She's hungry." "Go," Silas said softly. "We'll have time to talk more tomorrow." But as Abigail settled into the rocking chair by the fire, nursing her daughter in the warm glow of the embers, she found herself thinking not about tomorrow, but about all the tomorrows that might stretch ahead of them. Teaching position or no teaching position, legal complications or simple happiness. The choice was hers to make. For the first time in her life, she was truly free to choose her own path. And increasingly, that path seemed to lead not away from this mountain sanctuary, but deeper into it toward a future built on love and choice rather than duty and expectation. The next morning brought Mrs. Holloway's gentle inquiries about the teaching position, Brother Matthew's practical concerns about legal protections, and Naya's knowing smiles as she observed the subtle changes in the way Silas and Abigail moved around each other. But it also brought an unexpected visitor, one whose arrival would test their newfound happiness in ways none of them could have anticipated. The stranger rode into their clearing just after breakfast, a young man perhaps 25 years old, with the soft hands and clean clothes of someone who had never known real hardship. He dismounted carefully as if unused to horses and approached the cabin with obvious nervousness. "Excuse me," he called out in a cultured voice that marked him as educated. "I'm looking for Mrs. Abigail Tate." Silas stepped protectively in front of Abigail, his hand resting casually on his rifle. "Who's asking?" The young man straightened his shoulders, trying to project an authority that his trembling hands betrayed. "My name is William Hartwell. I represent the Territorial Attorney General's office." "Attorney General." Brother Matthews emerged from the barn, his expression suddenly wary. "What business would the Attorney General have here?" "I've been sent to investigate reports of illegal marriage, child abandonment, and possible kidnapping," Hartwell said, pulling a folded document from his coat. "I have warrants to question Mrs. Tate and to examine the children in question." The peaceful morning shattered like glass. Abigail felt the familiar flutter of panic, but underneath it was something new. Anger, pure, clean anger at the way powerful men kept trying to control her life and steal her children. "Let me see those warrants." Mrs. Holloway stepped forward, her teacher's authority, making the young lawyer take an involuntary step back. Hartwell handed over the documents with obvious reluctance. Mrs. Holloway examined them carefully, her expression growing more skeptical with each line she read. "These are signed by Judge Harrison," she observed. "Yes, a very respected, a very purchased judge," Brother Matthews interrupted grimly. "Harrison's been on Jeremiah Tate's payroll for years." "That's a serious accusation," Hartwell said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "It's a serious truth," Naya said flatly, "which you'd know if you'd done any real investigating instead of just taking the Tates' word for everything." Hartwell's face flushed red. "I'll have you know I conducted a thorough investigation based on sworn statements from multiple witnesses. Witnesses who all happen to work for Jeremiah Tate," Mrs. Holloway asked mildly. "The source of the statements doesn't invalidate their truth," Hartwell replied, but his conviction was clearly wavering. "Doesn't it?" Abigail stepped forward, her daughters secure in her arms, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Tell me, Mr. Hartwell, did any of these witnesses mention that Jeremiah Tate tried to kidnap my children at gunpoint? Did they mention that he threatened to murder me and my friends? Did they mention that he explicitly stated his intention to steal my babies because he considers them property of the Tate family?" Hartwell's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. That is, those allegations weren't part of the statements I received." "How convenient," Silas said dryly. "Almost like someone was only telling you the parts of the story that served their interests." "This is all very interesting," Mrs. Holloway said, still studying the warrants. "But there's a more fundamental problem with these documents." "What kind of problem?" Brother Matthews asked. "They're issued for the wrong jurisdiction. Judge Harrison serves the Eastern District, but this area falls under the authority of the Central District. These warrants have no legal standing here." The words hit Hartwell like a physical blow. That can't be right. I was assured." "You were lied to," Mrs. Holloway said with gentle finality, "either deliberately or through incompetence. But either way, you have no authority to make arrests or remove children in this jurisdiction." "But I have a job to do," Hartwell protested weakly. "Then I suggest you do it properly," Brother Matthews said. "Talk to witnesses who aren't on the Tate payroll. Examine evidence that doesn't come from interested parties. And get your warrants from a judge who actually has jurisdiction over the area you're investigating." Hartwell stood in the middle of their clearing, looking lost and overwhelmed. Abigail almost felt sorry for him. He was clearly young and inexperienced, probably chosen for this job precisely because he could be manipulated into doing Jeremiah's bidding without asking too many uncomfortable questions. "Mr. Hartwell," she said gently, "would you like some coffee? You've ridden a long way and you look like you could use a rest." Yes, actually, that would be very kind." As they settled around the fire once again, Abigail found herself studying the young lawyer with new eyes. He was clearly intelligent, educated, and probably well-meaning, but he was also naive about the ways powerful men could manipulate the legal system to serve their own ends. "How long have you been with the Attorney General's office?" she asked as she poured coffee. 6 months, Hartwell admitted. "This is actually my first major investigation." "And who brought this case to your attention?" "Well, Mr. Jeremiah Tate filed a formal complaint alleging that his son's wife had been kidnapped and his grandchildren were being held against their will by dangerous criminals." "Did you think to ask why his son wasn't the one filing the complaint?" Mrs. Holloway asked. Hartwell frowned. "I assumed, that is, Mr. Tate said his son was too distraught by his wife's disappearance to handle legal matters." "Too distraught," Nia laughed harshly. "The boy publicly disowned her and his children, called her a whore and said he'd never acknowledge them. Doesn't sound very distraught to me." "You have witnesses to this?" Hartwell asked, pulling out a notebook. "We all witnessed it," Silas said, "along with his threats to murder Mrs. Tate once the children were weaned." Hartwell's pen froze over his notebook. "Murder? That's a very serious charge. It's a very serious crime," Brother Matthews observed, "which is why we're taking it seriously." For the next hour, they walked Hartwell through the real story: Caleb's seduction and abandonment of Abigail, her family's rejection, the attempt to take the children by force, Jeremiah's explicit threats. With each revelation, the young lawyer's expression grew more and more troubled. This is not at all what I was told," he said finally. "No, I imagine it isn't," Mrs. Holloway said dryly. "Powerful men have a way of editing stories to suit their purposes." "But the marriage," Hartwell said desperately. "Mr. Tate claims it was never legally valid." Brother Matthews produced the marriage certificate from his coat. "Performed by me, witnessed by 3 people, signed by both parties, and filed with the appropriate territorial offices. I'd say it's about as legally valid as a marriage can be." Hartwell examined the document with the careful attention of someone trained in legal matters. "This appears to be in order," he admitted, "but Mr. Tate claims his son was coerced into the ceremony." "By whom?" Abigail asked. "A 17-year-old farm girl with no money, no connections, and no power whatsoever. He says you used feminine wiles to entrap him." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Abigail felt heat rise in her cheeks, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "Mr. Hartwell, do I look like the kind of woman who could entrap anyone? I was overweight, naive, and desperately lonely. Caleb Tate pursued me, not the other way around. He made the promises, he suggested the ceremony, he signed the papers. If anyone was entrapped, it was me." Hartwell really looked at her for the first time since his arrival. What he saw was a young woman still recovering from childbirth, surrounded by people who clearly cared for her, holding her babies with the fierce protectiveness of a mother who had fought for their lives. Nothing about her suggested the calculating seductress described in the Tate complaint. "I think," he said slowly, "I may have been given incomplete information." "That's one way to put it," Nia said with grim humor. "What will you do now?" Abigail asked. Hartwell closed his notebook and returned it to his coat. "I'll file a report stating that the original complaint appears to be without merit. I'll recommend that the Attorney General's office decline to pursue charges and that the local authorities investigate the allegations of kidnapping and attempted murder instead. And the Tates will be very unhappy with me," Hartwell said, with a rueful smile. "But I became a lawyer to serve justice, not to serve the highest bidder." Relief flooded through Abigail so powerfully that she had to sit down. Another threat had been neutralized. Another attack on their small family had been turned aside. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another skirmish in a war that would continue as long as Jeremiah Tate drew breath. "This won't be the end of it," she said aloud. "No," Brother Matthews agreed. Men like Jeremiah don't give up easily, but each time they fail, they lose a little credibility, a little power. Eventually, even their allies start to wonder if supporting them is worth the risk. Eventually, Silas said grimly, isn't soon enough if they succeed in one of their attempts. Then we make sure they don't succeed, Mrs. Holloway said firmly. We document everything. We build a legal wall around this family that can't be torn down by money or influence. How? Abigail asked. By making your story public, by ensuring that every newspaper in the territory knows what really happened here, by making it politically impossible for judges and officials to rule against you without facing serious consequences. Publicity, Naya mused, the one thing powerful men fear more than the law. As they discussed strategies and possibilities, Abigail found herself marveling at the people who had gathered around her fire. A mountain man haunted by loss, a Ute woman with generations of survival wisdom, a traveling preacher with a passion for justice, a frontier teacher with connections to the territorial government, and a young lawyer discovering that justice was more important than career advancement. Together they formed something more powerful than the sum of their parts, a community united not by blood or law, but by shared values and mutual protection. It was what she had always dreamed of belonging to, even when she hadn't known such a thing was possible. That night, as the others settled in for sleep, Abigail sat by the fire nursing Mercy and thinking about the choices that lay ahead. The teaching position in Cedar Falls still waited, offering independence and respectability, but increasingly it seemed like a step away from something precious rather than toward something better. "What are you thinking about?" Silas asked quietly, settling into the chair beside her. "The future," she said. "All the different futures that are possible now. Any particular future catching your interest?" Abigail looked around the cabin at Naya, sleeping peacefully near the back wall, at Brother Matthews, wrapped in his bedroll by the door, at Mrs. Holloway, curled up in the chair they had given her, at Ruth, sleeping in her cradle, and Mercy nursing contentedly in her arms, at Silas, whose presence had become as essential to her as breathing. "The one where we're all still here tomorrow," she said finally, "and the day after that, and the day after that. Just taking it one day at a time. Just taking it one day at a time," she confirmed. "But taking it together." Silas reached over and gently touched Mercy's tiny hand, and Abigail felt her heart swell with a happiness so complete it was almost painful. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever new threats the Tates might devise, they would face them as a family. Not the family she had been born into, or the one she had briefly imagined with Caleb, but the one she had chosen and that had chosen her in return. Built not on obligation or tradition, but on love freely given and gratefully received. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying the promise of another storm. But inside the cabin, warmed by fire and fellowship and the unshakable bonds of chosen family, the future felt bright with possibility. Spring arrived early that year, melting the snow with an urgency that surprised even Silas, who had watched the seasons change in these mountains for 5 years. By mid-March, the cabin was surrounded by the green shoots of new growth, and the sound of running water filled the air as streams swollen with snowmelt rushed down toward the valley. It felt like nature itself was celebrating the new life that had taken root in their small sanctuary. Ruth and Mercy had grown strong and healthy through the winter months, their personalities beginning to emerge in ways that delighted their makeshift family. Ruth was the quieter of the two, content to lie in her cradle and observe the world with serious dark eyes that reminded Abigail powerfully of Silas. Mercy, true to her name, was the more demanding twin, quick to cry when hungry or uncomfortable, but just as quick to smile when her needs were met. "She's going to be trouble, that one," Nia observed one morning as Mercy fussed impatiently while waiting for her breakfast. "Strong will and a voice to match." "Good," Abigail said, firmly settling into her chair to nurse. The world tries to silence women's voices early and often. The stronger hers is the better. Mrs. Holloway looked up from where she was preparing lessons for the Cedar Falls school. She had decided to stay through the spring, partly to help establish the new educational program, but mostly Abigail suspected because she had grown fond of their unconventional family. "You've decided against the teaching position then?" "I've decided for this," Abigail said, gesturing around the cabin. "For home, for family, for the life we're building together. And the legal complications, your marriage to Caleb, will be dealt with when they need to be dealt with," Silas said from his workbench where he was crafting a larger cradle to accommodate the growing twins. "Brother Matthews thinks we have options." "More than options," the preacher said, looking up from his Bible. He had also extended his stay, claiming he was needed to minister to the scattered settlements in the area. But Abigail knew he remained partly because he had become invested in their story, determined to see it through to whatever conclusion awaited them. "I've been corresponding with colleagues in the territorial capital. There's growing interest in your case among legal reformers." "What kind of interest?" Abigail asked. "The kind that sees your situation as an opportunity to establish important precedents about women's rights and children's welfare. There are people in high places who would very much like to see Jeremiah Tate's influence curtailed." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, not the frantic gallop of men bent on violence, but the steady pace of travelers. Silas rose immediately, as he always did when strangers approached, but his posture was alert rather than defensive. "4 riders," he reported from the window. "Don't recognize them, but they're flying a territorial flag." They emerged from the cabin to find themselves facing an official delegation led by a middle-aged woman in traveling clothes that spoke of both practicality and authority. She dismounted with practiced ease and approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. "Mrs. Abigail Tate?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Yes?" Abigail replied cautiously. "And you are Judge Sarah Whitmore, Territorial Supreme Court." The woman's smile was warm, but her eyes were shrewd as they took in the scene before her. "I've come to discuss a rather unusual legal situation." Abigail felt her stomach clench with familiar fear, but Silas stepped protectively to her side. "What kind of legal situation?" "The kind that involves forged documents, jurisdictional irregularities, and some very serious allegations against one of the territory's most prominent families." Judge Whitmore's gaze shifted to include the entire group. "May we speak privately? I assure you I'm here as a friend, not an adversary." They gathered once again around the fire that had become the heart of their small community. Judge Whitmore accepted coffee gratefully and spent several minutes simply observing the domestic scene, the babies sleeping peacefully in their cradle, the evidence of shared meals and comfortable companionship, the subtle ways the adults arranged themselves to protect and support each other. "You have an interesting household," she said finally. "It works for us," Abigail replied carefully. "I can see that. And after reviewing the extensive documentation that Brother Matthews has provided, along with Mr. Hartwell's revised report and several other independent investigations, I can understand why you've chosen to defend it so fiercely." "Independent investigations?" Mrs. Holloway asked. "When allegations this serious are made against someone of Jeremiah Tate's prominence, we take them very seriously indeed. What we've uncovered is disturbing." Judge Whitmore opened a leather satchel and withdrew a thick folder of documents. Forged warrants, purchased testimony, intimidation of witnesses, attempted kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder. The list goes on. "Are you saying the Tates are finally going to face justice?" Naya asked with barely contained hope. "I'm saying that the territorial government can no longer ignore their crimes," Judge Whitmore replied. "But I'm also here to offer Mrs. Tate some choices about how she wants to proceed." "What kind of choices?" Abigail asked. "First, the matter of your marriage. The ceremony performed by Brother Matthews is legally valid, but it was also performed under false pretenses. If you choose to pursue an annulment, you would have very strong grounds. And if I choose not to, then you remain legally married to Caleb Tate with all the rights and protections that entails, including inheritance rights for your daughters. Abigail felt the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. Legal freedom from Caleb versus financial security for Ruth and Mercy. Personal independence versus practical advantage. "What would you recommend?" she asked. Judge Whitmore smiled. "I'd recommend that you consider a third option, one that might give you the benefits of both choices without the disadvantages of either." "I'm listening." Caleb Tate is facing serious criminal charges for his role in the attempted kidnapping and the conspiracy to commit murder. If convicted, he would lose his inheritance rights and his father would be forced to restructure his will. In that scenario, your daughters could be named as primary heirs while you regain your legal freedom. "Would Jeremiah agree to that?" Silas asked skeptically. "Jeremiah Tate is facing his own set of charges," Judge Whitmore replied grimly. "He's going to have very little choice in the matter." The implications of this revelation rippled through the group like stones dropped in still water. After months of feeling hunted and threatened, the tables were finally turning. "There's more," Judge Whitmore continued on. "The territorial government is prepared to offer you a substantial settlement for the trauma you've endured, enough to ensure your daughter's education and future security regardless of what happens with the Tate holdings." "In exchange for what?" Abigail asked, her instincts warning her that offers this generous always came with strings attached. "Your testimony, public testimony about everything that happened, the seduction, the abandonment, the attempted kidnapping, the threats. Your story could help establish legal precedents that protect other women in similar situations. Making her a target for every enemy the Tates have ever made," Silas pointed out. "Perhaps, but also making her a symbol of resistance against the kind of abuse that too many women have endured in silence." Abigail looked around at the faces of the people who had become her family, seeing concern and love and unwavering support in every expression. Whatever she decided, they would stand by her. The question was, what decision would be best, not just for her, but for Ruth and Mercy and all the other women who might face similar choices in the future. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked. "The trial begins in 6 weeks. We would need your answer within the month." After Judge Whitmore and her delegation departed, the cabin fell into thoughtful silence. The adults moved through their evening routines with unusual quiet, each lost in their own contemplation of what the judge's offer might mean. It was Nia who finally broke the silence. "You're going to do it," she said to Abigail. It wasn't a question. "Am I?" "You have the look of a woman who's made up her mind, same look you had right before you pulled that trigger during the siege." Abigail considered this, testing the truth of it against her own feelings. "I think you're right. I think I decided the moment she mentioned other women in similar situations." "It won't be easy," Mrs. Holloway warned. "Public testimony means public scrutiny. Every detail of your life will be examined, questioned, criticized." "Let them examine it," Abigail said with growing conviction. "Let them see what happens when a young woman trusts the wrong man and pays for it with everything she holds dear. Let them see how a community of good people can come together to protect the innocent and fight injustice." "And if the Tates retaliate?" Silas asked quietly. "Then we'll deal with it the same way we've dealt with everything else together." Brother Matthews cleared his throat. "There's something else to consider. If you testify publicly about your marriage to Caleb, it will establish a legal record that could be difficult to change later. Are you prepared for that permanence?" "What do you mean?" "I mean that if you ever want to marry again, truly marry for love rather than legal protection, you'll need to resolve the Caleb situation first." The words hung in the air between them, and Abigail felt heat rise in her cheeks. as she realized everyone was looking at her and Silas with knowing expressions. Their growing closeness hadn't been as subtle as they had imagined. "Cross that bridge when we come to it," Silas said gruffly, but his eyes met Abigail's with unmistakable warmth. "Just saying it's a bridge worth thinking about," Brother Matthews replied with a slight smile. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Judge Whitmore sent legal advisors to help Abigail prepare her testimony, and newspaper reporters began arriving to document what was being called the trial of the decade. The isolated mountain cabin found itself at the center of a media storm that reached far beyond the territorial boundaries. Mrs. Holloway proved invaluable during this period, using her connections to ensure that the coverage remained sympathetic to Abigail's cause while protecting the privacy of Ruth and Mercy. "Public interest is useful," she explained, "but public intrusion can be devastating. We need to control the narrative." "Is that what we're doing?" Abigail asked one evening as she reviewed her prepared testimony. "Controlling a narrative, we're telling the truth," Brother Matthews said firmly. "The fact that the truth serves our purposes doesn't make it less true, but it feels calculated, strategic, like I'm using my pain for political gain." Naya looked up from where she was mending clothes by the fire. "Your pain has meaning beyond itself now. It can prevent other women from suffering the same way. That's not calculation, that's purpose." "She's right," Silas said from his usual place by the window. "You've been given a chance to make something good come out of something terrible. That's a gift, not a burden." As the trial date approached, the cabin filled with visitors, legal advisors, journalists, women's rights advocates, and curiosity seekers drawn by the growing notoriety of the case. But through it all, the core family remained constant. Abigail and her daughters, Silas with his quiet strength, Nia with her practical wisdom, Brother Matthews with his moral clarity, and Mrs. Holloway with her connections to the larger world. The night before they were scheduled to depart for the territorial capital, Abigail found herself unable to sleep. She rose quietly and stepped outside into the spring air, breathing in the scent of pine and new growth. In a few hours she would leave this sanctuary and enter a world that would judge her, question her, and dissect every choice she had ever made. Second thoughts. Silas emerged from the cabin, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. Third and fourth thoughts. Abigail admitted, accepting the warm cup gratefully. What if I'm not strong enough? What if I break down on the stand, or say the wrong thing, or make everything worse? Then you pick yourself up and keep going, same as you've done every other time life knocked you down. This is different. This is public. This matters to more than just us. Silas set down his coffee and took her hands in his calloused fingers warm against her skin. Look at me, Abigail. Really look at me. She met his eyes, seeing in them the steadiness that had anchored her through the worst months of her life. The woman standing in front of me crawled through a blizzard while in labor to protect her unborn children. She stood up to armed men to defend her babies. She learned to shoot and fight and think strategically because her family was threatened. You think telling the truth to a courtroom is beyond your capabilities. When you put it like that, that's exactly how I put it. You're stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and more important to this world than you understand. Tomorrow you stand up in that courtroom not as a victim but as a survivor, not as someone asking for pity but as someone demanding justice. Abigail felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, tears of gratitude and love and determination. What did I do to deserve you? You fought for something worth fighting for. You chose love over fear, hope over despair, family over solitude. Silas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. Same choice I made when I found you in that snow. They were interrupted by the sound of the cabin door opening. Nia emerged, followed by Brother Matthews and Mrs. Holloway, all of them apparently as unable to sleep as Abigail had been. Group insomnia, Mrs. Holloway asked with a wry smile. "Seems appropriate," Brother Matthews replied. "Tomorrow changes everything for all of us." "Tomorrow finishes what we started," Naya corrected. "We've been building toward this moment since the night those men rode up to this cabin with their guns and their arrogance." They stood together in the pre-dawn darkness, 5 adults who had been strangers less than a year ago, but who had become something more precious than blood family, a chosen family forged in crisis and strengthened by shared purpose. "Whatever happens," Abigail said quietly, "I want you all to know that this has been the happiest time of my life. Here in this place with all of you, this is what home feels like." "Home isn't a place," Mrs. Holloway said softly. "It's the people who love you unconditionally and stand by you when the world gets dark." "Then we'll always be home," Silas said simply, "no matter where life takes us from here." As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the peaks in shades of gold and rose, they prepared for the journey that would take them away from their sanctuary and into an uncertain future. But they prepared together as a family, and that made all the difference. The trial itself proved to be everything Judge Whitmore had promised, and more. The territorial capital's largest courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and legal observers who had come to witness what many were calling a watershed moment in territorial law. Jeremiah and Caleb Tate sat at the defendant's table with their expensive lawyers, their faces masks of controlled fury as the prosecution laid out a case built on months of careful investigation. When Abigail took the stand, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. But instead of the crushing anxiety she had feared, she found herself filled with a calm certainty that surprised her. She looked out at the crowded courtroom and saw not judgment but expectation, people waiting to hear a story that needed to be told. "Mrs. Tate," the prosecutor began, "please tell the court how you first met Caleb Tate." And so she did. In clear, steady tones, she told the story of a lonely 17-year-old girl who had believed the lies of a charming young man. She described the false promises, the secret wedding that wasn't meant to be secret, the cruel rejection when she announced her pregnancy. She spoke of her family's abandonment, her near death in the blizzard, her rescue by Silas Boone. When she described the attempted kidnapping, her voice grew stronger, more defiant. She looked directly at Jeremiah Tate as she recounted his threats, his casual discussion of murder, his complete disregard for her humanity and that of her children. He said, "I was nothing," she told the court, "that I was just a vessel that had carried his precious Tate blood, that once my children were weaned, I would be disposed of like any other inconvenience." The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs, and the judge had to call for order. But Abigail continued, her voice never wavering. "I want the court to understand that this wasn't just about me. This was about every woman who has ever been used and discarded by powerful men. Every mother who has been told her children don't really belong to her. Every person who has been treated as property rather than as a human being with rights and dignity." When the defense attorney cross-examined her, trying to paint her as a scheming gold digger who had entrapped an innocent young man, Abigail's responses were calm and factual. She acknowledged her naivety, her mistakes, her desperation, but she never wavered from the central truth of her story. "Yes, I trusted Caleb Tate," she said when pressed about her motives. "Yes, I believed his promises. Yes, I was foolish enough to think that a rich man's son could actually love a poor farmer's daughter. But wanting to be loved isn't a crime. Believing in promises isn't entrapment, and being young and naive doesn't make someone deserving of abandonment and attempted murder." The trial lasted 2 weeks, with testimony from dozens of witnesses and evidence that painted a damning picture of the Tate family's criminal enterprise. Brother Matthews testified about the validity of the marriage ceremony. Naya described the threats and violence she had witnessed. Even young William Hartwell took the stand to admit how he had been manipulated into pursuing false charges. But it was Silas's testimony that proved most devastating to the defense. The mountain man who had spent 5 years in solitude spoke with quiet authority, about what he had witnessed, his obvious integrity lending weight to every word. When he described finding Abigail dying in the snow, carrying her to safety and helping deliver her children, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. "Why did you help her?" the prosecutor asked. "Because she needed help," Silas replied simply. "Because abandoning a pregnant woman to die in a blizzard is the act of monsters, not civilized human beings. Because those babies deserved a chance at life, and she deserved the chance to give it to them." "And what did you expect in return?" "Nothing. You don't help people because you expect something back. You help them because it's right." When the defense attorney tried to suggest that Silas had his own improper motives, the mountain man's response was swift and cutting. "I buried my wife and unborn son 5 years ago," he said, his voice heavy with old grief. "I know what it means to lose everything that matters. I wasn't about to let that happen to someone else if I had the power to prevent it." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous on all counts: guilty of conspiracy to commit kidnapping, guilty of criminal threats, guilty of attempting to pervert the course of justice. Jeremiah Tate was sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison. Caleb received 10 years for his role in the conspiracy. But the legal victory, satisfying as it was, paled in comparison to what happened next. As they emerged from the courthouse, Abigail found herself surrounded by women, some wealthy, some poor, some young, some old, all of whom wanted to tell her their own stories of abuse and abandonment, their own struggles against powerful men who saw them as disposable. "You gave us hope," one elderly woman said, tears streaming down her face. "You showed us that it's possible to fight back and win." "You made them listen," said another, a young woman not much older than Abigail herself. "For the first time they had to listen to what it's really like for us." In the weeks that followed, as news of the trial spread across the territory and beyond, letters began arriving at the cabin, hundreds of them from women who had found courage in Abigail's story to leave abusive marriages, to report crimes that had been ignored, to demand better treatment from employers and authorities. Mrs. Holloway, who had agreed to help manage the correspondence, was amazed by the response. "You've started something," she told Abigail one evening as they sorted through some of the day's mail. "A movement, maybe. Women are organizing, demanding changes in the law, running for local offices. All because of one trial. All because of one woman who refused to be silenced," Brother Matthews corrected from his chair by the fire. "Sometimes that's all it takes, one person willing to stand up and tell the truth, no matter the cost." The financial settlement from the territorial government had indeed been substantial, more than enough to secure Ruth and Mercy's futures. But Abigail found herself more interested in the other opportunities that had emerged from her newfound prominence. Women's rights organizations wanted her to speak at rallies. Newspapers wanted her to write about her experiences. Politicians sought her endorsement for reform legislation. "It's overwhelming," she confessed to Silas one night as they sat together on the cabin's front porch, watching their daughters sleep in their cradle nearby. At 6 months old, Ruth and Mercy were healthy and beautiful, their personalities continuing to develop in delightful ways. "Overwhelming but important," Silas replied. "You have a platform now, a voice that people will listen to." "Do I want that kind of life, though, constantly traveling, speaking, being in the public eye? I don't know. Do you?" Abigail considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, she would have said no without hesitation. She had wanted only privacy, safety, the chance to raise her children in peace. But the trial had shown her something else. The power that came from speaking truth to power, the satisfaction of seeing justice done, the possibility of using her pain to prevent others from suffering. "I think," she said slowly, "I want the choice. I want to be able to say yes when it matters and no when it doesn't. I want to raise my daughters here in this place that saved our lives, but I also want them to see that their mother is someone who fights for what's right." "That sounds like a good balance." "It sounds like a lot of work," Abigail replied with a laugh. "But then everything worthwhile usually is." They were interrupted by Nia emerging from the cabin with 2 cups of her special evening tea. "Talking about the future again, trying to figure out what shape it should take," Abigail confirmed. "Future takes the shape you give it," Nia said, settling into her own chair. "No more, no less." "Very philosophical. Very practical. You've got choices now that you didn't have before. Money influences people who will listen when you speak. Question is, what do you want to do with all that?" Before Abigail could answer, Ruth began to fuss in her cradle. But instead of crying, she made soft cooing sounds, as if she was trying to join the conversation. Mercy, not to be outdone, added her own voice to the mix. "They're getting so big," Abigail marveled, lifting Ruth to settle her more comfortably. "They'll be walking before we know it," Silas observed. "Getting into everything, asking endless questions, demanding explanations for how the world works." "Good," Abigail said firmly. "I want them to question everything. I want them to never accept 'because I said so' as an answer. I want them to grow up knowing that they have the right to make their own choices and the strength to defend those choices." "They'll have all of that," Nia said with certainty. "With you as their mother and this family supporting them, how could they not?" As summer deepened into autumn, the cabin became a hub of activity, unlike anything Silas had experienced in his years of solitude. Visitors arrived regularly, some seeking Abigail's advice or support, others simply wanting to meet the woman whose story had captured the territory's imagination. Brother Matthews had established a regular circuit that brought him back every few weeks, and Mrs. Holloway had set up a permanent correspondence office in what had once been Silas's workshop. The additions to their family continued to surprise and delight them all. Judge Whitmore became a regular visitor, often bringing news of legal reforms inspired by Abigail's case. Young William Hartwell had left the Attorney General's office to start a practice defending women's rights, and he frequently sought Abigail's input on his cases. Even some unexpected allies emerged from the aftermath of the trial. Caleb's younger sister Margaret arrived one day with a formal apology for her family's actions and a desire to establish a relationship with her nieces. She proved to be everything her brother and father were not: kind, intelligent, and genuinely remorseful about the pain her family had caused. "I should have spoken up," she told Abigail during her first visit. "I knew what Caleb was like, knew how my father operated. I should have warned you, should have tried to help." "You were in an impossible situation," Abigail replied gently, "and you're helping now when it matters most." Margaret became a regular presence in their lives, bringing gifts for the babies, and gradually earning her place in their extended family. Through her, they learned that Jeremiah's business empire was crumbling without his direct control, that many of his former allies had distanced themselves from the Tate name, and that significant portions of the family wealth were being liquidated to pay legal fees and victim settlements. Justice, Nia observed with satisfaction when Margaret shared this news. Sometimes it takes time, but it comes eventually. As winter approached, once again Abigail found herself reflecting on how much had changed since that terrible night when her parents had abandoned her in the snow. She was no longer the frightened, naive girl who had trusted the wrong man and paid so dearly for it. She had become someone stronger, wiser, more confident in her own worth and her ability to shape her destiny. The legal complications of her marriage to Caleb had been resolved more simply than anyone had expected. His conviction for conspiracy to commit kidnapping had nullified their marriage contract under territorial law, leaving Abigail free to make her own choices about her future. The substantial settlement had been placed in trust for Ruth and Mercy, ensuring their security regardless of what other changes life might bring. "So," Silas said one evening as they prepared for another winter in their mountain sanctuary, "what now?" "Now we keep building," Abigail replied, watching her daughters play together on a blanket by the fire. At nearly a year old, they were walking and beginning to talk, their personalities more distinct with each passing day. Ruth remained the thoughtful observer, content to study the world around her with serious attention. Mercy was the explorer, constantly testing boundaries and challenging limits. Building what? A life, a family, a future worth having. Abigail looked around the cabin that had become so much more than a shelter. It was truly home, now filled with love and laughter and the daily rhythms of a life well lived. Building something that lasts. Brother Matthews cleared his throat from his chair by the bookshelf where he was reading to anyone who cared to listen. "I've been thinking about the spring," he said, "about what comes next for all of us." "And," Mrs. Holloway prompted, looking up from her correspondence, "and I was wondering if anyone would be interested in a wedding." The words dropped into the evening quiet like stones into still water, sending ripples of implication through the group. Abigail felt her cheeks warm as every eye in the room turned toward her and Silas. "Are you proposing, Brother Matthews?" Silas asked with dry humor. "Because I should warn you, I'm not really your type. I'm proposing that two people who obviously love each other stop dancing around the subject and make it official," the preacher replied with a grin, "unless there are objections." Abigail looked at Silas, seeing in his eyes the same hope and love that filled her own heart. They had been moving toward this moment for months, perhaps, since that first night when he had carried her to safety through the storm. But speaking it aloud, making it real and official, still felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. "Well?" Silas asked softly, moving to kneel beside her chair. "What do you say, Abigail Puitt? Will you marry me not for legal protection or practical convenience, but because I love you and your daughters more than I ever thought possible?" The proposal was nothing like the elaborate romantic gesture Caleb had staged all those months ago. There were no false promises of wealth and status, no dramatic declarations of undying passion, just a good man offering his heart to a woman who had learned the difference between pretty words and honest devotion. "Yes," she said simply, her voice steady and sure. "Yes, I'll marry you, Silas Boone, because I love you too, and because I can't imagine a better father for my daughters or a better partner for the life I want to build." The cabin erupted in celebration, with Naya producing a bottle of whiskey she had been saving for a special occasion, and Mrs. Holloway immediately beginning to plan the most romantic mountain wedding anyone had ever seen. Ruth and Mercy, caught up in the excitement, clapped their hands and babbled happily as if they too understood that something wonderful was happening. As the evening wore on and the others gradually settled in for sleep, Abigail and Silas found themselves alone by the dying fire, their daughters sleeping peacefully between them. The circle was complete now, not just the family they had chosen, but the commitment that would make it permanent. "Are you sure about this?" Abigail asked softly, taking on a ready-made family, dealing with all the complications that come with marrying someone like me, someone like you. Silas reached over to touch her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "You mean someone brave enough to fight for her children, strong enough to survive abandonment and betrayal, generous enough to forgive even the people who hurt her. Someone who turned a broken mountain man's solitary existence into a life worth living. Someone with a complicated past and an uncertain future. Everyone has a complicated past, Abigail, and the future's uncertain for all of us. What matters is who you choose to face it with." "Then I choose you," she said firmly. "Today, tomorrow, and for all the days that come after." Outside, the first snows of winter were beginning to fall, but inside, the cabin warmed by love and surrounded by family, the season felt full of promise rather than hardship. They had weathered one terrible winter and emerged stronger for it. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, not as isolated individuals struggling against an indifferent world, but as a family united by choice and strengthened by shared purpose. The woman who had once crawled through a blizzard to protect her unborn children had found something she had never dared to hope for, a love that asked nothing of her but honesty, a home that welcomed her completely, and a future bright with possibility. In a world that had tried to break her, she had instead found the strength to rebuild herself into someone even better than she had been before. And in the mountains of Colorado Territory, where winter winds carried both danger and renewal, a new kind of family continued to grow, one built not on obligation or tradition, but on the radical idea that love freely given and gratefully received could overcome any obstacle, heal any wound, and create miracles even in the darkest of times.